welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Tsukaman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Sarit Zehavi. She's the founder and the head of Alma Research and Education Center in Israel. She's also a reservist lieutenant colonel in the IDF, and we'll be discussing with her the current security developments and challenges facing Israel. The program is focusing on the tension between the new alliances forming as a result of the Abraham Accords and the counter alliances on the other side, the Iran-led axis of resistance, which consists of Iranian proxies such as the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and other lesser-known groups and militias, but also state actors that are forming closer defense and security relations with Iran and how that impacts Israel's security concerns. Sarit, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Before we jump into the meat of the discussion, I'd like to ask you to share a little about yourself, your background, and how you came to found the center and what it does.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I established this center a few years ago. It's actually my initiative and kind of my life mission. When I served in the army, I briefed a lot of delegations that came to the Israeli northern borders to hear about the security challenges here with Hezbollah or in Syria, or whatever. And for me, it was, I discovered that I have kind of a gift that I can explain complicated message in simple words that people that are coming from outside of Israel and don't know too much around this issue can understand, and it's really, really complicated. When I ended my service a few years ago, I understood that this is what I want to do. I have MA in Middle Eastern Studies, and actually since I was 16, I knew that this is what I want to do. I want to research the Middle East. I want to understand the Middle East better. I want to understand our neighbors better. And I think that this dream, since I was 16, along with this understanding and my experience in the army, eventually this is what brought me to establish an institution that has an educational branch and a research branch, that it's a combination on both, and actually provides accessible knowledge about Israel's security challenges on the northern borders, on the one hand from a very professional point of view, but of course also from a very personal and authentic point of view, since all of the Alma staff are living here in the north, and we take our job very seriously and very personally. Everything that happens on the northern borders is affecting our daily lives. We see with our eyes what is happening on the borders. We see Hezbollah on the borders. We see the developments of the infrastructures, either of the IDF or Hezbollah, with our own eyes. We hear at night. If something happens on the border, we can hear it because I live like 11 kilometers from the border, which is far away. Again, there are friends that are living even closer to that. And for us, it's really important to provide a point of view that is hardly being delivered by the regular media outside of Israel. This voice is hardly heard, and we wanted people to hear our voice directly, no filters, either face-to-face. This is how we started. I started as a small business standing on the border, briefing the groups, and later on, Alma became a non-profit institution based on mainly donations and staff that actually it's not a business. The idea is to provide this knowledge to everybody who is interested in to learn and willing to listen, put it this way.
What's the biggest challenge in transmitting this information, or which type of audience do you find the most challenging?
There are tons of challenges, actually. I can't pick one. the first challenge is how do you explain something that complicated, that strange to the people that are coming here, and all they heard of is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they know nothing about the rest of the Middle East. They know nothing about what's happening, you know, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and the relationships of all of these together, state and non-state players. And you need to, you know, to explain all of that in 40 minutes, because that's all you've got. So you need people to listen, to want to listen, to be willing to listen, and to understand. Sometimes it's 40 minutes, and sometimes it's more. And I think this is a great challenge. Another challenge is, how do you deliver eventually? How do you, you know, explain these things while outside people hear completely different things about Israel, about how Israelis view the use of force. What's the IDF like? They are coming here with, some, not all of them, of course, but some of them are coming here with specific point of views of what it is like to be Israelis, what it is like to be the state of Israel or the IDF. And when they meet us, they discover that it's not exactly what they came with. It's actually very, very different. And sometimes this gap creates a situation that they need more time to understand. They are coming with a lot of answers, but actually they are going back with a lot of questions. But you know, the challenge is also an opportunity. And it brings, again, the fact that they are going back with a lot of questions, I hope will make them try to find the answers using a variety of sources, and that way get a wider picture of what's going on here.
And what type of audience have you found the most challenging to access? Is there a particular type of people, group of people that tends to be the toughest crowd?
Wow, I think that the students are the most challenging crowd. And I meet people from around the globe, from various backgrounds, from policymakers to opinion makers to students to just businessmen, whatever. I think that the students are challenging in a way that they do ask questions that, again, are based on their bias and their sometimes fake information about what's going on here. And my mission is to, okay, they ask the question, are they willing to listen to the answer? Are they really looking for answers which are completely different from what they thought of? And my mission is to try to answer them in a way that, again, that will make them doubt. I'm not trying to convince them by anything, by the way, but at least make them doubt about what they thought of, and again, ask more questions. I think that's the most important thing, and that's the most challenging sometimes with students that are coming here believing that they are following the news and they know what's going on, but actually the news are not enough.
And you mentioned something very interesting. You mentioned that all these people who have only heard of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, not anything else that's going on in the region. Until recently, the Israeli-Palestinian issue was indeed the driving subject of anything Middle East related in Europe, in mainstream media, even in the United States, all these academic discussions. But at some point, we have seen the conversation shift, specifically mostly to Iran. At what point did you personally notice the shift, and to what extent does this misconception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as the central issue defining the region is still a stereotype?
Look, I don't live in the States, so I truly don't know. That's my personal impression. Maybe I'm wrong, but you tell me. As far as I know, there are a lot of demonstrations in the campus and protests in the campuses around the Israeli policy in West Bank. Is there protest in the campuses on behalf of the Iranian women, on behalf of half of the population in Syria that lost their homes and became homeless in the past decade, 500,000 people that lost their lives in the civil war in Syria? Now, of course, I'm not even, trying to compare Israel to these dictatorships. Israel is trying to be a Western country with different values, and I'm very happy that the demands are different. I am not expecting anybody to judge me as, the butcher of Damascus, which is Assad. But I think that, on the other hand, to view all these troubles of the Middle East as if they are deriving from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's inaccurate. It's even more than inaccurate. The best example, by the way, for me, that shaped my motivation to do what I'm doing, one of the things that shaped it, is what happened in Paris. That there were ISIS attacks in Paris a few years ago, and right afterwards, the French president went to initiate a peace initiative between Israel and the Palestinians. Come on, you have to fight ISIS. It has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How do you fight ISIS? Now, ISIS today is not what it used to be. ISIS is the radical Sunni Islam, while Iran is the radical interpretation of the Shiite Islam. It's, for Westerns, it looks the same, but actually it's two different ideologies, and actually they are enemies of each other. And today I can say that the reason that the northern borders of Israel, such as Lebanon and Syria, and further to Iraq, are actually all failed states is because of Iran. And I think this is very important for people to understand the negative influence of the Iranian involvement in the region. Now, everybody around the world is witnessing this negative involvement in Ukraine, in the fact that Iranian drones are attacking the Ukraine cities in Europe. But so in a way, it makes my life easier, but it doesn't make me happy. I wish there wouldn't be Iranian drones in Ukraine, and there wouldn't be Iranian drones launched at the cities of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Israel as well.
This issue has become, Iran and its related impact on the region has become more of an existential issue for the region itself. Nevertheless, we have seen artificial efforts within certain circles to prop up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the, disproportionate focus on the human rights issues when it comes to Israel, and to kind of distract from the Iranian human rights abuses both domestically and externally. We have seen campaigns attacking Israel in the media. We have seen State Department initiatives, the UN recent initiatives with the nuclear issue, and so forth. How do you explain this logical inconsistency when it's very clear to the academics, to all these countries, where the danger really is? I mean, I understand not liking Israel, having biases, all of that we don't need to explain, but there is a real security concern globally right now. What drives these people to ignore that threat and to focus on something completely insignificant?
No, it's not completely insignificant. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is significant. It's important. Human rights in Israel and human rights in West Bank are an important discussion. I'm not running away from that. And it's good to have this discussion. The question is, do we put this discussion in context? That's the first question, which you mentioned the UN, so the answer is no. And the second question is, do we take this discussion and copy it to completely different discussions that has nothing to do with it, such as what is happening between Iran and Saudi Arabia, what is happening in Lebanon, and I don't know, Syria, ISIS, etc. I think this is very important. Why this is happening? Tons of explanations, beginning with anti-Semitism to actually denying the idea of nation states, which is funny. Israel is a nation state. It has an Arab minority within the nation state. But Israel is not the only nation state in the world. And I think that maybe the younger generation is trying to deny this notion of nation states. And maybe it could be a nice idea if we were in a situation of end of history and everybody were willing to accept everybody and talk and live together. But in a situation that I cannot come to Berkeley and speak freely because I will be intimidated, or there are areas that I'm not allowed to speak, and I'm an Israeli, let's talk about American Jews that cannot come and speak there because they like express views that are pro-Israeli. This is not a world that accepts otherness, that is open to pluralism. And I think that this atmosphere of there is, of the defining, the definition of what is right and what is wrong without context, without understanding the full situation. And this is, I think, the main reason, which is ignorance. People truly don't know. They don't have all the information. In many cases, they are holding fake information or the wrong information. In a world of social media where they are not exposed to views that are different from their point of view, where you think you learn history, and I see this with my kids, you think you learn history because you watched a few tweets or a few Instagram videos that are 2 minutes long instead of reading a book. And even if you read a book, did you read the book from, that are telling a few narratives or just one narrative? In this world, I think it is becoming more challenging because it's not that there is lack of information, there is too much information. How do you choose which information to adopt and to believe to? These are questions that I'm being asked by the students all the time. How would we know what is right or wrong? How would we know what is fake and not fake? And my answer is that you don't always know. The only way is to read from various sources that have different biases and to recognize the fact that everybody has bias. Not only those who are pro-Israel or those who are against Israel, everybody has bias. Everybody has an agenda. If you understand that and you get used to reading text this way, you can, take off all the noises and understand what's the picture.
You mentioned something very interesting, the denial of nation states among students, but not just. We are seeing the idea of national sovereignty and territorial integrity being challenged in various ways. The war in Ukraine is one example, but regionally we have seen that going on for a very long time, long before the current events with Russia. We have seen various proxies, Iranian proxies, groups, ISIS, all of these groups challenging the idea of national states. At the same time, we have seen liberation movements and national movements by non-state actors, minorities in Iran, Kurds all over the region, who also do not have a state and yet do not have a massive international support movements. And we have seen the challenging discussions around the Sykes-Picot Treaty and the effect it had on the region, and whether it's even legitimate today when many ethnic groups in the region have never been part of that decision-making process. How do we balance out these concepts of respecting national borders, territorial integrity, with the idea of demands for sovereignty stemming from people who have been previously disenfranchised?
What you're saying is so important because actually when we look at the Middle East and we discuss this question of nation states in the Middle East, we understand that in the Middle East, the idea of nation state was foreign and it was imported to the Middle East. And especially, for example, in Iraq. Iraq is a very good example. Jordan is a very good example. Syria is a very good example. And yet we cannot ignore the local identities of all these places. If you look at Syria, those who are coming from Damascus and Damascus area definitely have a local identity. Those who are coming from Aleppo, and I'm saying that since my father was born in Damascus, and I know, you know, the way of thinking. Those who were born in Aleppo definitely had centuries of identity of what is this area of Aleppo. Those who came from southern Syria, named Huran, definitely had an identity. The question is these identities are the same as the borders that were created in the Middle East eventually. Lebanon is another example to this. The Christians wanted to establish the state of Lebanon as the only Christian state of the Middle East, but very quickly they discovered that there are more in Lebanon, which are not Christians, Druze and Shiites and Sunnis. And how do you do that? And I think that until today, they are asking this question, how do you do that? While in Lebanon, they became the minority, which is even more challenging in this kind of situation. So in a way, I can totally understand why there is a denial of nation states. But on the other hand, we cannot erase completely the national feelings of nations, of people that do identify with their national identity. And there are many people like that, whether they are Palestinians or Jews, or I don't know, Ukrainians or French. Okay, there is a national identity. It exists, except there are more identities. And in the Middle East, I can speak of a religious identity, a local identity, which is local, meaning the city or the village or the family that you are coming from. And I can talk of a national identity that in some of the places, the national identity is relatively weak. I didn't mention Egypt, for example. Why didn't I mention Egypt? Because in Egypt, there is a national, they succeeded. There is a national identity. Yes, it adapted a lot of Muslim values into this, but they took the heritage and the history of the Egyptians thousands of years ago, and they connected to that. If you speak about the Jews, yes, it's the same. I must tell you honestly, as an Israeli, as a Jewish Israeli, when I took my kids to the Western Wall and walked underground and touched the 3,000-year stones that my fathers built, and it's the same language they spoke, Hebrew, they spoke the same language, it's the same vocabulary. The text is there in the Bible, a text that we can actually read and understand. I cannot feel disconnected just because my own father is from, I don't know, as I've said, Damascus, and my husband's father is from Slovakia. Eventually, there are practices that we experience for thousands of years, and one of these practices is a connection to Jerusalem. Thousands of years, we were praying to come back to Jerusalem. We cannot ignore all of this piece of history and say, okay, let's forget about nations. So I know what I'm saying is full of contradictions, but you know, one of my professors once told me, human beings are full of contradictions. That's maybe the secret to understand what's going on here.
So what is the framework by which we can reconcile these geopolitical concerns? On the one hand, respect for borders that allows us to conduct, trade, international relations, and on the other hand, the fact that historically you've had evolving views of identity, evolving views of nationhood, of peoplehood, and you've had colonial powers that have imposed their own vision on tribal societies and that are now being reconfigured. How do we deal with this? And what sort of where does Israel find itself among all these other groups who are torn by these identity issues and border issues, and that are also being exploited by bad actors?
Definitely, Israel cannot deal with what is happening internally in those neighboring countries. Okay, if you ask me what we are doing in Alma Center, we are trying to follow that, understand that, and create knowledge around that so people can and share it with the rest of the world, so people will be able to understand. When we speak about security, this is definitely challenging, the multiple identities, because eventually when you are trying to understand who controls Lebanon, who is behind an agreement that we just signed with the Lebanese state, what is the Lebanese state? When you're trying to understand Syria, where this is heading in Syria, Can we talk about an improvement of the security situation on our Syrian-Israeli border, or are we going to experience greater risks? We must take in consideration the implication of these identities, of various identities, into the picture, and that affect their loyalty or disloyalty to the government. So, I can only say that inside Israel, this is also something that we are dealing. It's a question that we are dealing with. And there are a lot of, again, variety of opinions around that. But the bottom line is that, and you see the Israeli flag behind me, the bottom line is that eventually, as I've said, Israel was created as the homeland for Jews, while Judaism is not just a religion, it's also a nationality. And it's okay, because there are people that are saying, I'm Chinese, and they are loyal citizens of the United States. It's okay. There is nothing wrong with saying that Judaism is also a nationality, and being a citizen loyal to the US flag as well. People are holding multiple identities. That's the trick here. And at the same time, if I'm looking into, into Israel, I think that we Jewish Israelis must understand that within this framework that was created of the state of Israel as the homeland for Jews, there are 20% Arabs, which are a minority here that we cannot ignore. And we must find more and more ways, and we are doing that, but not enough, to integrate these 20% of Arabs into this framework that we had created almost 80 years ago.
That brings us to the issue of regional cooperation. You have already a situation with complex identities, with a complex dynamic between different societies internally and the way they relate externally to each other. In the middle of that, Israel is trying to not only at this point merely survive and prosper, but also become a more integrated member of the region. We have seen that Abraham Accords brought Israel closer to a number of states, including Morocco, UAE, Bahrain, three tribal monarchies that are nevertheless perfectly willing to cooperate with Israel on a number of fronts, and who are all facing threats from the same enemies. How does that actually work in practice? And the reason I'm not asking for top secret information, but I am asking for the framework and to understand how these defense relations work, given that culturally all these countries are very different. There is some history of background cooperation, certainly, but it's one thing to do so behind the scenes on localized matters, and completely different to have to deal with the mammoth issue that we're seeing of Iran and its proxies today, and other regional threats as well. So what form do you see this taking? How does that actually work, and how can it withstand the natural challenges of very different countries trying to resolve their own issues while also dealing with external threats?
I think there are two basic things that happened here that motivated these countries that you mentioned to join this initiative of the Abraham Accord. One is the fact that, as you mentioned, there is a joint enemy, which is the Iranians. There is a threat. We all face the same threat, maybe from different reasons, but we all face the same threat. I can only mention that the UAE, for example, is much closer to Iran than Israel, 80 miles. And Israel is about 1,500 miles from Tehran. So for them, this is a very realistic threat. The Iranian, and I don't want to say an enemy, but maybe a rival, someone who is trying to shaken the framework that was created of what is the UAE state. Okay, what is composed of, how the regime works there, what the administration looks like. And Iran is actually trying to undermine that. And the UAE understand that. The nuclear program of Iran definitely was an accelerator in this process. So actually, I think that there are two motivations, or main two motivations that made these countries that you've mentioned that joined the Abraham Accord to do so. One is the fact that, yes, we do share the same enemy, which is Iran. And the fact that the nuclear program of Iran definitely accelerated this process, because everybody in the Middle East, or almost everybody in the Middle East, understood that if Iran will become nuclear, it's a threat to the whole of the Middle East. Okay, the question whether or not Israel is nuclear, I don't want to get into this, but if you assume that Israel is nuclear, it's not a risk to all of the Middle East. Israel is not threatening to destroy any country in the Middle East whatsoever. While the Iranians are undermining the security and stability of the countries around us. And I already gave a few examples. And I think this is why it's so important to the countries around us to make sure that Iran will not become nuclear. By the way, I must mention in one sentence that what is happening in Ukraine now, I hope that due to what is happening in Ukraine now, also the rest of the world will understand that a nuclear Iran is not only dangerous for the Middle East or for Israel, it is dangerous for the world, as we could see with what is happening now in Europe. So that's one thing, the fact that Iran, 80 miles from the UAE is much closer to Iran than Israel. We are 1,500 miles from Iran. The UAE is only 80 miles. This makes us share something, as you mentioned, security collaboration and cooperation. We just read in the newspapers that Israel provided aerial defense systems to the UAE. I guess we will hear more about that. There is probably more collaboration when we speak about information, exchange of information. Israel was joined to CENTCOM recently, which enables us to connect with some of these countries in the Middle East in an American platform. And I think this is also very important. Other than that, the second motivation, I think, is the civilian motivation, not the one that is about security or military or whatever. Is the one that actually, you know, after almost 80 years that Israel exists, and it's a story of success, we cannot ignore it. You know, when we speak about economy, development, the quality of life of people here, by the way, from all sects and religions, we understand that it's a story of success. And I think that Morocco and Bahrain and the UAE also understand that Israel is here to stay. We are not going to disappear. And now you have two questions. You want to continue to fight it, or you want to make peace with it and to try to get some benefits out of the fact that we are here, because we are not going to leave. I hope that more players here in the Middle East will understand that. And it will be for the benefit of everybody, because economic collaboration and tourism and, you know, building these bridges between the societies. And I see this with, you know, the huge amount of tourists that are coming from Israel to these countries. I see this with industry collaboration, innovation conferences that, you know, Israel is a startup nation. There are so many things that we can do together. I think that these countries understood that. And since they understood that, this can definitely create a new atmosphere in the Middle East. But in order to make this atmosphere, you know, something that can win against other trends, negative trends here, because we are like experiencing two completely contradicted trends now, we need more players to join in. I think it's very important to cultivate and encourage more players to join into the Abraham Accords.
I'll be blunt. I see several obstacles on that happening. Not the least of them being some of the players in the United States, namely the Biden administration, which has quite actively discouraged even the use of the terms of Abraham Accords. It has put a lot of pressure on other players so that they had to focus on their own internal matters. I'm speaking specifically of Saudi Arabia. We have seen some of the smaller countries have their own issues unresolved. Oman and Qatar, for instance, are not necessarily view Iran the same way as UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, for instance. And there are also other dynamics. We have Russia, China coming into the region with their own interests and agendas. So there is a number of challenges to attract these players to a formal coalition, especially when particular movements are discouraging them from doing so. But before we even get to that point, before we get to the point of having more players, even looking at the ones who are currently in that coalition, we are seeing challenges. You just renormalized with Iran, possibly in response to U.S. pressure and the whole obsession with the return to the nuclear deal, which is, I'll get to that as well. But we are seeing that there is a huge volume of trade between Iran and UAE. There's physical proximity. There are people being abducted from UAE, such as an Iranian born German national, a US resident who was abducted from Dubai last year and by the Iranian services. How does that impact US attempts to cooperate on security matters with UAE? Is that a challenge? Is that a concern?
First, I must say again, I don't want to get into US politics. Tomorrow there are elections in Israel. I can vote only for elections in Israel, not for any American president, Republican and Democrat. If I'm looking at the history, not only of the past few years, but look into decades ago, I can say a few things in general. It doesn't matter which administration. Eventually, the most important thing is to be consistent and to try to understand that people here in the Middle East thinking and operating and behaving a little bit differently than the people of the US. For example, a written agreement, it's not important. Has no meaning if you don't go through a process that those who signed the agreement truly believe in the agreement. Elections have no meaning if you don't go through a process that the people in this country understand what democracy is, and then you have elections. Iraq is a great example. Eventually what you get is that people will vote for the person they know from their own family or in their own town. And we experience that in some places in Israel as well when we speak about local elections, for example. Democracy is something that people in the Middle East were not educated upon. Nowhere. They don't know what it means. Now, it's not that we need to teach them what is democracy. It's that we need to understand what is their way of life and then create a dialogue. Instead of coming and saying, no, we want to create a dialogue that is based on our values, our understanding, our way of life. No. And UAE, I think it's a great example because the UAE is a success, at least for now. It's a success of building, if you like, a nation state that is not based on democracy, but they succeeded in creating something, which for us, it's almost impossible to understand. So at least let's understand that it's different. It's a different world, different expectations. And if we understand that it's very, very different, and we respect the fact that it's different, we are not trying to make it similar to the way we think, maybe, American administrations, doesn't matter who it is, will succeed in creating influence or different way of influence in this really crazy or different Middle East. The fact that the UAE opened back its embassy in Iran, I agree with you that it represents or reflects kind of a disappointment from the fact that Biden administration viewed Iran as a very important player. But it doesn't mean necessarily that they are going to neglect the Abraham Accord. And this is something that we should understand in the Middle East. It's okay to play on both places. It's okay. The UAE don't want to choose. The UAE says, I accepted Israel. I can get a lot of benefits from collaborating with Israel. If at the same time I can create a dialogue with Iran, why not? This is their point of view. It's something that for us, how can they do that? But they are doing that. They didn't damage any aspect of the relationship with Israel after opening the embassy in Iran.
Do you think that makes trust building between the two countries more difficult, though.
I think the trust is something that we cannot discuss yet.
Mm-hmm.
We can discuss collaboration, we can discuss acceptance, we can discuss, exchange of delegations and cooperation. Leave trust aside. It's not the issue here.
Let's look at it from the situation from another angle. On the one hand, you have these several countries trying to collaborate openly for the first time. Openly, I say, because again, we've had some level of informal collaboration previously, but for the first time, they're taking it into public light. On the other hand, you have Iran and its regional infrastructure and its attempt to kind of influence UAE, influence Bahrain, influence whoever it can to bring them over more to their side. And not all of these efforts are going to be violent. Some of them are going to be trade-based. Some of them are going to be influence campaigns using lobbies, using cultural influence, using political kind of penetration of these countries where Iran has had a long history of collaborating, while Israel has been, a fairly recent, structural player. How do you see that playing out in the long term? Having Iranians politically involved in those countries without necessarily trying to ruin diplomatic relations, but actually taking advantage of this for intelligence, for political kind of manipulations, and so forth.
In Hebrew, there is a saying, I'm not sure it will sound good in English, that everybody or anyone should do its mission.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I understand the Iranians want to create more influence anywhere they can in the Middle East. They are trying to undermine the stability of the countries in the Middle East. I got it. Okay. The Iranians are trying to create influence in the United States. They are having terrorist cells in the United States. They are encouraging people to go violent in the United States. And they are not going to stop doing so because of the nuclear deal or whatever. Mm-hmm. They're not going to stop doing so. It will continue. Okay, I got it. Now the question is, what do we do? And I think if I'm looking at that from the UAE perspective, from the Middle Eastern perspective, I think they also understand that the Iranians will continue to do what they're doing. And the UAE will have to do what it's doing. And the UAE will have to continue to play on both places, to have diplomatic relationship with Iran, but still suspect and be careful from Iran. Israel will have amazing collaboration and cooperation with the UAE, with Morocco, with Bahrain, but I cannot say that Israel will provide all its secrets or security secrets to all these countries like tomorrow morning. So we all know exactly what's the limitations of these relationships that are now being created. And we all understand that, and it's okay, it's fine.
In the middle of all of this, we are seeing greater pressure to kind of normalize certain players, namely Assad in Syria and the Lebanese Hezbollah entity. I wouldn't know where to separate the two at this point. And this delineation and demarcation agreement, I wouldn't call it a peace treaty, but it's, a territorial agreement, is just one example of an attempt to kind of normalize this process by the media for sure. They have tried to portray this as a way of additional legitimacy to this hybrid entity that we are seeing, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hezbollistan, whatever you want to call it. How do you see these efforts to kind of claim that Assad is the least of all evils, that he needs to be reintegrated, engaged, while he's being even more bulwarked by Iran and previously by Russia, but now more by Iran, and Hezbollah is making additional demands after the conclusion of this agreement. Where do you see this all going? Do you see people are that blind to the character of these particular actors? Are there any other options to engage with them? Where is it ultimately going?
I think that, again, one of the things that should be understood, that there is not always there is a solution. I heard one of the experts for the Middle East once said, stop solutionizing the Middle East. Okay, now under this statement, let's try to handle each of these topics that you mentioned. Maritime border agreement between Lebanon and Israel is not about normalization. It's not about recognition of the state of Israel by the state of Lebanon. All of that is wishful thinking of I don't know who, but here everybody understands what it's all about. And it's eventually about money and a little bit about politics. But first about money, because there is a lot of gas that was found in these areas, and it was a mutual interest to get the gas out of the sea. Now, we can have a debate, which I'm not sure it's the right place to explain all the small details of this agreement. The bottom line is that we understand that we signed an agreement that Hezbollah was involved in its details along the way. We understand that. We understand that we signed an agreement that mostly accepted the Lebanese position, that we made a huge concession here in Israel. We understand that we signed an agreement that gives the Lebanese the option to harvest gas. We don't know how much gas is there, whether there is gas on the Lebanese side, but we also don't know who is going to benefit from this gas, whether it's the state, the people of Lebanon, the Lebanese, or Hezbollah, which is also Lebanese. We understand all of that. We understand the advantages and disadvantages of this agreement. And in this list of advantages of disadvantages, normalization is not part of this list. And getting closer between Beirut and Jerusalem is not part of this list. Everybody should understand that Hezbollah doesn't accept Israel's right to exist. There is no way that this agreement can change that. It is not going to be changed as long as Hezbollah has this kind of control on the Lebanese government. Hezbollah is a member of the Lebanese government. There is no political decision that is being made in Lebanon without the concession of Hezbollah, without the agreement of Hezbollah. So, and as long as Hezbollah is that a stronger player in the Lebanese politics, even with all, again, what you hear, that there is criticism and Hezbollah is weak and he lost the elections, all of that is between out of context to inaccurate. Because yes, there is criticism against Hezbollah in Lebanon. It didn't lose the election. The allies of Hezbollah lost the elections. And everybody's asking what kind of government should be established after these kind of results in elections that were held last May. It's been 5 months since the elections in Lebanon. And there is a reason why there is no government until today. And the reason is because Hezbollah will not enable a government that is against Hezbollah to be formed in Lebanon. And as long as Hezbollah has this kind of influence inside Lebanon, and as long as Hezbollah doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, I don't see any place for, Abraham Accords, like people try to say, with Lebanon. It's just not going to happen. So this is about the maritime border and Hezbollah. Another thing which is very important to mention around that is that there are two armies in Lebanon. There is the Lebanese armed forces and there is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is stronger than the Lebanese armed forces. Hezbollah is much more professional, is well equipped, and it is equipped with tens of thousands of missiles, 2,000 drones that are targeting the state of Israel and that are hidden in the homes or under the homes of the Lebanese, mainly the Shiite Lebanese, meaning that Hezbollah is using its own people as human shields. As long as this is the situation, that Hezbollah is getting its orders from Iran and Lebanese armed forces are getting its orders from the Lebanese government, which Hezbollah is also a member of the Lebanese government, I don't see how we can have a solution that everybody's looking for. So sometimes we just need to contain, and I think this is what the Israeli policy is all about in many places. How do we contain a crisis that we cannot solve?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about Assad. Look, I'm very careful here because as Jew, for me to say that Assad is okay and to give him a kosher certificate after he gassed his own people, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that. Assad is a war criminal, he's a butcher, he's responsible for the death of 500,000 people in Syria in the civil war. He is responsible for the destruction of the state of Syria, and he was never elected in democratic election. Let's not be mistaken. Now, after we understand all of that, again, you want to ask the question whether there will be peace between Israel and Syria? Assad today is, is kind of a player that everybody plays with. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Syria is the hunt. And everybody is sharing the hunt. Iran, Russia, Turkey, a little bit for Assad, very small bit, Hezbollah, maybe small area, very, very, very small area for the Americans, some areas for the Kurds, very small areas that ISIS is still present, but not as a state. There is no sovereign state of Syria. If you ask whether Assad can control the state of Syria, if tomorrow morning Iran, Russia, all these players that I've just mentioned will leave Syria, Assad will not be able to control the state of Syria. And even now, there are areas in Syria that everybody knows that Assad is not there. So I don't know to say that he's, as you said, the least, I don't know how you presented that. When we speak of a war criminal, I don't know. For me, it's really difficult to connect to this point of view. But eventually, Israel and Israelis are not those who are designing the future of Syria. By the way, this is one of the fake information that I got. That people truly believed that Israel is deeply involved in what's happening in Syria. And this is wrong, because we tried to be involved in internal issues of our neighboring country named Lebanon in the 80s, and we failed. And we learned from that, and we understood that we cannot decide what would be the future of Syria. That's why you don't see Israel trying to overthrow Assad or to cultivate an opposition leader or whatever. What you see Israel is doing is actually what we call campaign between the wars, which means that we IDF target ammunition, mainly ammunition of Iran or Hezbollah that is getting into Syria either by the air, by the maritime air route, or by the land. I guess more by the land recently. That this ammunition may endanger the state of Israel. Ammunition that may endanger the state of Israel. Making these rockets accurate, drones, long-range missiles, whatever. This is something that Israel must target, but we are not targeting, for example, the symbols of the Assad administration, because we don't want to be involved in this.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of Iran and bringing in ammunition into Syria, there's Iran has been trying to build a land bridge going through Iraq to Syria, and externally, the Americans who are present strategically in a very limited capacity have been kind of a bulwark against the full fulfillment of that. Do you think Iran can succeed in going around Americans, or do you think Americans will eventually withdraw if, for instance, Iran demands it in exchange for a nuclear deal?
Again, if you can repeat the last question, I didn't understand.
Do you see a possibility of Iran finding a solution against around US presence blocking it from completing the land bridge? For instance, can Iran either find some other route that does not include Americans, or for instance, can they offer quid pro quo of JCPOA in exchange of Americans letting them pass?
Okay. To your second question, I don't think that signing or not signing a deal will make Iran stop or not stop its land bridge, or again, aerial bridge or maritime bridge. First. Second, the Americans are blocking the southern route of this land corridor. They are not blocking the central one, which goes from Tehran through Iraq, through an area named El Bukamal, which is a border crossing between Iraq and Syria, and from there to Damascus or Aleppo, and from there to Beirut. This land corridor is highly active. There are proxy militias of Iran that are securing these main points along the corridor that I've just mentioned. Iran is integrating into civilian infrastructures and cities, even sometimes small towns in Syria, whether it's demographically or economically or socially, to create a social or a civilian platform to this military land corridor. When we say land corridor, just to clarify to everybody, it's the route that Iran uses to smuggle ammunition and sometimes combatants from Tehran to Syria, to Lebanon, to provide it into the hands of Hezbollah as well. So there is a land corridor or a land corridor route that is not blocked by the Americans, and it's active and it's happening. And the more you see campaign between the wars or attacks that are reported by the Syrians, and probably happened against, for example, runways in airports where you have the flights landing with the ammunition. So the Iranians understand that the aerial route is a problem, and that way they go to the land corridor, which is a little bit more difficult to trace, but for them it's much more difficult to secure. It's a long route. As I've said, it's around 1,500 kilometers. It's not easy. So, you know, there is kind of a balance, not a balance, all the time a chase of Israel trying to stop the corridor, and Iran is developing new ways, and Israel is finding these new ways and trying to stop them, and then Iran is finding more new. As I've said, there is not always a solution. Sometimes you just have to continue the campaign as long as it lasts from the other side.
We have seen in recent couple of weeks an escalation in the Israeli attacks on some of these Syrian Iranian infrastructure points. What is the cause of this? Is Israel simply trying to be more assertive in light of the upcoming elections, or is there a real security escalation that we should be aware about?
Last week, Israeli reporters said that they didn't see Israeli attacks in Syria in the past month. And the question was asked, how come there were no attacks in the past month? And then we had 3 attacks at the same week, so now you're asking whether there is an escalation. No, eventually these attacks, again, assuming they were carried out by Israel, are only due to operational opportunity and intelligence that says that there is a smuggling of dangerous ammunition into the region. That's it. And it shouldn't be more than that, by the way. I don't expect anything else from my leadership. Doesn't matter which leadership. Doesn't matter whether it's Lapid or Bennett or Netanyahu or Gantz, I don't know who. It doesn't matter in this respect. All of them will take care of the security of the state of Israel when we deal with the issue of this kind of ammunition that is being smuggled from Tehran to the region. All of them.
what happens to the ammunition that is, somehow manages to bypass or escape Israeli attacks in Syria? Where does it go next?
Either it stays in Syria, or more probable, it goes to the hands of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, here I want to say something. Hezbollah in Lebanon created a huge civilian infrastructure of service, providing of services, civilian services, to the population that created dependency between the Lebanese Shiites to Hezbollah in a way that enables Hezbollah to hide all this ammunition inside the towns and under the towns, as I've mentioned. Iran is now putting a lot of efforts to create this platform in Syria as well. And it's not easy because the demography in Syria is different than in Lebanon. And how do I see that? If you ask about a change in the scope of attacks, so I don't see escalation, but I do see things that are happening, that there are attacks in areas that we saw less attacks or hardly attacks in the past, such as areas that are neighborhoods. Of course, no civilians are getting killed, but yet it's in neighborhoods that are dominated by the Iranians. There is what we call Iranian neighborhood in Damascus, and we see attacks over there. Again, Israel is to be blamed on these attacks. If Israel attacked or didn't attack, eventually we can conclude that somebody wanted to attack military presence of Iran inside the neighborhood. And this is something that is very important to understand and to put the finger on, because it means that the Iranians are putting effort to make the Syrians human shields as well, not only the Lebanese.
So far, Hezbollah's massive arsenal of all these missiles and so forth has been left largely unattached. It has been not been addressed by the international community, and frankly, the only call that I have seen to disarm Hezbollah in international came from Saudi Arabia about a year ago at the United Nations General Assembly by the King. Since then, there's been dead silence concerning this, even raising the possibility of having Hezbollah disarmed. Is it due to the impracticability of such a campaign? What is the cause of the silence and this, elephant in the room, quite frankly?
First, I must say that there are at least two resolutions of the United Nations Security Council that are talking about the disarmament of Hezbollah. One is 1559 from, I think it was 2005 or the end of 2004, after the assassination against Prime Minister Hariri by the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And this resolution, again, wanted to create a new future, a new prospect, a new reality in Lebanon. And they called to the Syrians to leave Lebanon, which they did. They called to have elections in Lebanon, which they were. And they called to the disarmament of Hezbollah, which didn't happen. And thereafterwards, in 2006, after the war between Israel and Hezbollah, the resolution that ended the war said that 1559 should be respected, and that the area next to the border between Israel and Lebanon should be empty of illegitimate weapons, and we have 10,000 UN soldiers that should inspect that, or at least assist the Lebanese army and force that. And none of that is happening. None of that is happening. Actually, the UN forces that are in South Lebanon are intimidated on daily basis by the Hezbollah. So maybe I should be the one who would ask the question, and we should ask the international community, do you truly want to change the reality in Lebanon? And if you truly want to change the reality in Lebanon, maybe you should start from demanding the Lebanese to follow the international decisions. It's for the benefit of the Lebanese themselves. Because there were international decisions. And I must tell you that when I was in the army, just before the war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006, we all honestly believed that the international community is on top of that. and it will disarm Hezbollah. And what happened after Hariri was, you know, an earthquake, kind of an earthquake, the assassination of the Prime Minister Hariri, that everybody in the world understood that Hezbollah is a problem, that it must be disarmed and it must be dealt. We truly believed in this. And eventually what happened is that we got the Hezbollah abduction of the 2 Israeli soldiers and bombing all of the Israeli communities next to the borderline, and war, and much more rockets since then.
Well, today Hezbollah has even more ammunition than it had in 2006. It had a massive explosion, which it has covered up inside, you know, where it was storing ammunition in explosives in a civilian area. We've had President Macron travel to for negotiations with Hezbollah, and we have seen US and France and other countries pledge humanitarian support, even though it was clearly going to Hezbollah, and we've seen all sorts of diplomatic engagements with Hezbollah. So it seems to me exactly the opposite direction from pressure to disarm by any means. There's no, yes, a number of countries have added Hezbollah to their sanctions list, but it's not a huge number, and who knows how closely is that is being enforced in practical reality. Sanctions are not easy to enforce unless they're international, unless they're unified, and unless they're also complementing other types of action. So, okay, so Hezbollah is considered a terrorist organization, and yet it's almost like, okay, yes, they're terrorists, but here they are, and that's the reality, and they're part of political negotiations, and they're part of engagement, and you know, they're everywhere, and they're back to Africa now, and they're sprawling and recruiting new members from various communities, including non-Arab converts in Latin America. So we see them expanding their influence international and becoming more of a threat, more of an embedded problem. And there's been efforts to kick them out in Germany and everywhere, but you know, it's who knows how long that lasts. So is Israel particularly concerned about Hezbollah's growing internationalization and global power, or do they limit to more regional? Is Israel's concern more immediate, regional, and Hezbollah at the moment does not appear to want a major escalation?
First, just to what you said, I think there is a positive process here. I think that more and more countries in Europe designate the civilian wing of Hezbollah. Australia designated the civilian wing of Hezbollah. I think that in the past years, we have seen sanctions of both administrations, recent administrations in the United States, against Hezbollah companies and personnel, this or that. So I think there is a growing understanding in the world of the danger that Hezbollah poses to Lebanon and outside of Lebanon, and I'm happy for that. I agree that France is a tough nut to crack, but in general we see a positive process that, of course, there is much to work on, and the EU we should work with as well. But it's better than it used to be. Inside Israel, if you ask me as an Israeli, my main problem is the fact that I have all these artilleries falling on my head, or will fall on my head in a minute. Okay, that's the main problem. The main problem is that we understand that in the hands of Hezbollah, there is a ticking bomb that nobody knows when it's going to use it, in what scale, and against what. We can assume that it can definitely threaten strategic sites in Israel, civilian, military, social, infrastructures, whatever, which can create a lot of damage and casualties. And Israel will have to respond and to protect itself. Everybody understands that, okay? So there will be damage in Lebanon as well. So inside Israel, the thing that worries us the most is the aerial or the artillery arsenal of Hezbollah. But when we look globally, I totally agree with you that Hezbollah has infrastructures, by the way, a lot of economic infrastructures, everywhere in the world, everywhere you look in the world.
In the meantime, Hezbollah is not the only Iranian proxy spreading its wings. We are seeing Houthis who have, emerged from the short-lived truce and continuing attacking various targets in Yemen. They're back to being a regional concern, and over the past year or 2 years, they're strengthening their relations with other Iran-backed groups, including with Taliban, including with Hamas. Where do you see that sort of coordination going?
Iran is trying to create a situation of multi-fronts against Israel, beginning from the seashore, Lebanon, go through to Syrian border, and then Hamas in Gaza, in the south. And you know what? Even trying to connect, not always successfully, but trying to connect with Hamas supporters in West Bank, with in some of the places inside the Arab society in Israel, trying to smuggle arms and drugs, and there is a connection between the two, of course, when we speak of terror, into Israel in scales that we didn't see before, on all of the borders, by the way, from Lebanon to Syria, Jordan, everywhere. And yes, this is the mission of Iran now. One of the mission with regard to Israel is to create multi-front confrontation, and they understand that multi-front confrontation will create much more damage to the state of Israel than just facing one front. And that's why they support Hamas as well in Gaza. It's not about, shared ideologies. Hamas is Sunni, Iran is Shiite, but you see they put a lot of efforts to create compliance between Hamas and Syria, between the Syrian government, which these relationships were cut off at the beginning of the civil war in Syria. And they were renewed just last week.
Hamas was originally created as a counterweight to Fatah, and as was typically the strategy to back Islamist groups against pro-communist backed groups throughout the Cold War. But with Iran's increased backing, do you think it's still worthwhile to allow Hamas to proliferate, or do you think the moment of reckoning is coming when Israel will come to see Hamas as something that cannot be allowed to continue to exist as an infrastructure?
Hamas exists as an infrastructure. I don't see a situation how the Palestinian Authority is getting back to Gaza. Again, Israel don't want to be the one to do that. We don't want to be the one to do that. We don't see how the Gazians are doing that themselves. So I truly don't, and of course the Egyptians don't want to be involved. And Hamas, yes, it's a movement that its goal is to establish Palestine as an Islamic state, and if you like, even as a radical interpretation of Islamic state by the notion of the Muslim Brotherhood. Palestine as an Islamic state with no compromise of an existence of a Jewish state next to it, meaning that in the eyes of Hamas, the goal is to terminate the state of Israel and to establish Islamic Palestine instead. And that's why, again, to talk about negotiation, compromise, relationship, it's irrelevant in this discussion. We can only talk about how to contain the situation and find a way to have kind of a ceasefire and truce with the launching of rockets and balloons and explosive balloons, like kids' balloons that are explosives attached to it, that are being launched by Hamas or its other proxies of Iran, by the way, inside Gaza against the Israeli communities next to the border with Gaza. I think this is the main mission of the Israeli government. How to make sure this will stop. More than that, it's too much to ask.
So you don't think Hamas leadership or enough of it can be destroyed to really make a difference?
I don't think that what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Enough of Hamas infrastructure and leadership can be actually taken out completely or destroyed out of the equation, because at one point there was discussion that Israel could finish off Hamas but preferred not to, as a counterweight to Fatah and whatever. But at this point you're saying it's not even possible, even if Israel thought
It's impossible, but the cost is very high. It is possible, but the cost is very high. The cost will be very high for Palestinians, and the cost will be very high for Israelis, because we'll have a lot of rockets that will fall here and a lot of Israeli bombs that will fall there, and we don't want that. So I think that I can summarize with saying that eventually, if we will see a situation that we are getting back to what was happening here in the second Intifada, that 1,000 Israelis got killed, and we were afraid to go to restaurants. We're afraid to go on buses. I don't know if anybody can even try to imagine how post-traumatic we are. But when I'm going to DC and in the middle of the night I hear an ambulance, my instinct is this a terrorist attack? Because an ambulance in a big city is a terrorist attack. This is what I was hearing during 3 years in the second Intifada. We were afraid to enter a mall, because when we wait for the security person to check our bag, somebody can explode and, with suicide bomber or something. And it happened every week, sometimes twice a week. If we will get back to this kind of situation, Israel will do whatever it takes against Hamas leadership. But we are not there yet.
Now, speaking of threats to civilian populations, and in kind of getting back to the topic of Abraham Accords cooperation, we have seen that similar to what Hamas and Hezbollah has presented as a threat to Israeli civilians, Houthis have been a threat to UAE and Saudi Arabia, and of course Yemen. Saudi Arabia has been focused on its own internal affairs and its security problems that have not gotten easier since Houthis have been removed from US foreign terrorist organizations list. Do you see Israel potentially offering any sort of cooperation against Houthis, whether it's logistics or intelligence sharing or any sort of support? Is that potentially a ground for strengthening the cooperation between the two countries, and to what extent is that possible?
Between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Yes, specifically
I believe
of Houthis, actually.
I believe that cooperation between Israel and Saudi Arabia around security of both countries is already happening. I believe this is the case. I don't have,
Sure.
specific information, but I believe that this is already happening. The Houthis are definitely a threat to Israel as well. By the way, the poster of the Houthis in English and in Arabic says death to Israel, death to America. Not only Israel. So there is a place for collaboration. I think it's already happening in this way or another, which we don't know exactly, and it's okay that we don't know exactly. This is what I've said. It's a crazy neighborhood, and eventually those who accepted the fact that Israel is here to stay can benefit a lot from that.
Why am I asking this question now? My thought is going back to 2020, when we saw a major attack by Iran and Houthis on Aramco, which could have been prevented by the US in terms of at least intelligence sharing, but was not. But do you think in the future, something like that could be prevented again by Israel, or do you think there are situations where it's simply not going to be? Where is the limitation of how far Israel is going to be willing to cooperate on this particular front?
I don't think I can elaborate on that. The only thing I can tell you about Aramco attack, as far as I saw the faces of our leadership, they were kind of surprised with what happened there. And afterwards, there were meetings of our military and political leadership, understanding that there is a new threat that we should talk about and find ways to answer to, which again, I believe that if we find some ways that are not discussed in the media of how to deal with this new threat. And when I'm saying new threat, it's composed of drones, it's composed of location, which is Yemen, the area of Yemen, and it composed of the sender or the umbrella, which is Iran, behind it.
Given that these situations with the Abraham Accords on the one hand and the axis of resistance on the other are ongoing, it's certainly very hard to speak of who won or who will win in the long term. But based on what your assessment, how would you measure the dynamics, the success of each dynamic vis-a-vis each other at this point? Who, in your opinion, which movement, the pro-Abraham Accords, pro-stabilization movement, or the axis of resistance, which dynamic has more momentum at this point in time in the region?
It depends in which area or in which field, meaning that I don't see any reduction. Maybe I'm not an expert to that, but I don't see any reduction or walking backwards in our relationship with the UAE. I see development in our relationship with Bahrain and Morocco. Mutual visits of chief of staff and stuff like that. If you speak about Lebanon and Syria, this is exactly the opposite trend. So there are opposite trends in different areas of the Middle East.
Do you see, let me put it, I'm going to be blunt and not very diplomatic. Iran seems to be gaining followers despite its vast, horrible, its internal economic weakness, its horrible human rights abuses visible to the whole world. It nevertheless has not lost following among its militias around the region and gained. You could say it managed to even gain some. Israel, on the other hand, has not expanded formally Abraham relations past the number of countries who've entered them. What is the takeaway from this situation? Why is Iran seems to be more successful at gaining support openly than Israel in this regard? What can be done to challenge Iran's successful messaging?
All the time, and I was asked this question by sometimes students. Again, we started with the students, maybe we can end up with that, of what can we do? Okay, Sarit, we understand the picture, but in the campuses, it's not easy. What can we do? And my answer is that don't fight for Israel. Really, don't stop fighting for Israel. That's maybe it's not a popular answer. Fight for the Iranian women. Fight for the poor Syrians. Fight for the Lebanese. Fight for the Yemens. We can fight for ourselves. We will manage. But as you said, the people of Iran are starving, and human rights are violated every day. And tens of people were killed, at least tens of people, maybe more, were killed in the recent protest, which has been going on in the past 3 months. And I want to see people care about that. This is very important. I want to see people care more about what is happening there.
So essentially, the way going forward is to reframe the narrative, to focus on what really matters, and people who are suffering as a result of this, and exposing the hypocrisy of claiming to be for human rights, whereas human rights are being violated all over the region on a daily basis by this coalition of Iran-backed, militias.
I'll give you an example. For example, there were publications about the fact that there are elections in Israel, but there are those who cannot vote, and Israel is preventing them from voting. It's been running in social media, right? Palestinians cannot vote, and we are violating their basic right to vote. So here is the news. Arabs that are defining themselves as Palestinians, which are the citizens of Israel, can vote. Many of them choose not to, but they can vote. Okay? Palestinians could have voted to the Palestinian Authority, while the leader of the Palestinian Authority didn't go to elections. I don't know, for 2006, there were the recent elections in Palestinian Authority. More than 95% of the Palestinians living in West Bank and definitely Gaza, all of them, are not under the Israeli rule. They're under the Palestinian Authority rule. They should vote for elections if they were held Palestinian Authority. So all these protests that there are 2 million people that cannot vote for the Israeli government is just a misunderstanding of what's going on here in the past 25 years.
Now, I'm going to ask you one last question to wrap all of this up. Whereas the situation in Israel is actually improving, you've had even Muslim Brotherhood, although I wouldn't call it personal an improvement, but even Muslim Brotherhood parties as part of the ruling government. In the forces of BDS, pro-Iran Western groups, who are very successful at continuing to spread the messaging that Israel is apartheid, that there is discrimination, and it keeps working. And on social media, there is a huge drive, but not just in social media, in soft power institutions globally. Soft power, academia, foreign policy think tanks, the media, and so forth. This undertone, these guys, Westerners, I don't just mean Arabs or Iranians, have penetrated with this philosophy all of these groups. It's not just students on campus, it's literally the faculty, it's the people running these think tanks, it's the people making the news. How do you combat this sort of disinformation that's highly damaging to everything?
This is what I do every day. That's my life mission, to combat all of that. Now, I know I meet thousands of people every year, me and my staff, that are coming here, that are willing to come here. Sometimes we go outside of Israel. I'm about to go outside of Israel to speak outside of Israel. We publish a lot of information on social media and on our website. And that's the whole idea of what we do. We want to present a different point of view as a think tank to other think tanks, to other, I don't know, academy, journalists, whatever. And that's why I opened my presentation with saying that I wanted to do that without a journalist in the middle. I brief journalists as well, and it's important, but eventually I would prefer people to follow us.
Directly.
To see what we are publishing and to send us questions and to read what we write, because we believe that that's the only way to educate people and to provide them with the information.
But the problem is the audiences reaching you are already predisposed to at least travel to Israel and meet with you. The people who don't go to Israel or who've been there once, 10 years ago and haven't been there since, they follow the media. They follow the people who are quoted in the media, whoever is in there. How do you expand Israel's soft power reach, and not just Israel, but pro-Israeli, just pro-regional stability forces versus these other, movements and a sort of loose coalition of actors who is very much disruptive to this process?
Day by day in the social media, day by day in webinars like this, in interviews, again and again and again and again. Of course, I'm not the only one. There are many people that are doing that, each of us in a different way, to provide the knowledge day by day. Yes, we are, if you check the quantity rather than the quality, so you see that we are less. Okay, less people believe in Israel or that Israel should exist, comparing to those who believe that Israel shouldn't exist. That's the reality. I understand that that's the reality. But for me, day by day, I'm not giving up. Day by day, again and again and again, not only by meeting them face to face, but also on social media. We are everywhere in social media, beginning from TikTok to Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, to every age. There is social media information that is provided by Alma. And of course, the website that has all the information there, day by day. There is no other way, only to educate, only to provide information. I don't see any other way. I must tell you, I can sit here and tell you that everybody are anti-Semitic, and there is nothing we can do about it. I don't accept that. People were not born anti-Semitic. They were not born that way. So if they were not born that way, we can provide them a different insight if they're just willing to listen. And many of them are willing to listen, actually.
That is indeed hopeful. I think people are tired of fake news and tired of outright lies. And one great advantage of Abraham Accords is that you do have people who can now access Israel for themselves and see for themselves and bring that message back, and nobody can stop them. Then there's not, you can't continue with the lie when people can see with their own eyes what's going on. So the main thing is to motivate more people to come to Israel, not just send Israelis to these countries, but to get regular people from UAE, from Morocco, from Bahrain, from anywhere else that you can get them to come and visit.
Definitely, and this is already happening, and I've met these groups as well. It's so important.
I hope that number of them will continue to grow beyond kind of the same groups of activists, more professionals in different industries, more and frankly, I hope to see more Egyptians, more Jordanians being able to follow suit. It's not a
Irena, bear in mind that many of these delegations that are coming here are discreet.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, this is part of the problem that we face when we speak about Middle East and the views of many people, as I've just described what's happening in the United States, many people in the Middle East are afraid to say we went to Israel,
Mm-hmm.
we now understand better,
Mm-hmm.
wow, we learned a lot, we think that Israel should exist. People are afraid to say this point of view because it's not popular. And so I think there are much more people that believe in this than those who are willing to admit that on social media.
Well, the question, I guess the answer is to continue fighting until that dynamic will shift, until it is better, until it's easier to say things that are of being open-minded than of being afraid to. And that's where the governments, of course, come in, but
not easy when somebody threatens your life afterwards, and it happens.
Exactly. But it's also about fighting radicalization. It's fighting mentality. It's not just fighting government laws and regulations. It's also fighting that mindset and breaking through that mindset. That
the social environment. The social environment.
The primary challenges. Well, with that in mind, thank you so much for your insight. It was a very interesting conversation, and I hope people listening it will re-examine their assumptions from what they've seen in the media and the coverage that are sometimes too pessimistic or too optimistic or just not within the realm of reality or just inaccurate. Period. And start asking what can we learn? How can we get more involved? How can we understand better? What can we do to get more accurate information out there?
As I've said, don't rely on one source.
Mm-hmm.
And don't rely on two sources that have the same bias.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to read about what's happening here, choose, and I'm doing this exercise with students sometimes, choose a source from Israel, a source from Palestinians, a source from Saudi Arabia, and a source from Iran, for example. Okay, 4 sources, and follow all 4 sources, and all of them are accessible in English. And that way you can create a better understanding of what's going on. Of course, I recommend everybody to follow us, Israel-alma.org. We provide tons of information in the fields that we believe are interesting to us on the northern borders. We don't get all the picture of everything that is happening in the Middle East. But yeah, if you use multiple sources from different bias, different point of views, I think you can get, for a long time, you can get a better understanding.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure hosting you here on the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This was Sarit Zehavi from the Alma Research and Education Center, and as usual, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and next week we'll be joined by a new guest at the same time, 9 p.m. Tuesday night. Thank you. and have a
Thank
good
you very
night.
much, Elena.
Thank you.